The first sound was not the explosion, but the whistle. It came over the bare Hunsrück ridge as a thin, rising thread, almost delicate, like the beginning of an artillery salvo, that had lost its way. Feldwebel Karl Hagemann stood in the open cupola of his Tiger, number 203, and narrowed his eyes toward the grey northern horizon. The air over the distant woods shimmered with cordite haze and morning mist. Somewhere out there, across the valley and beyond the river, the Americans were still forming up. The rangefinder, in his trained mind, said 2,000, maybe 2,500 meters. Too far for anything but harassment fire. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Then, the whistle thickened, turned into a tearing roar, and hit the slope below them in a sheet of brown earth and stone. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. The blast threw dust over the Tiger's glacis and sent fine gravel rattling against the turret side. It had not been aimed directly at them. That made it worse. Only the impact crater was 30 meters short and 10 meters left, a lazy correction away from the next round. The sound of the detonation was heavy, deeper than the sharp crack of a 75 or the flatter boom of a standard field gun. In the loader's hatch, Unteroffizier Meissner swore under his breath. "That was no 75, Herr Feldwebel." Karl did not answer at once. He knew the catalogue of Allied guns, as well as he knew the worn leather of his headset. British 17-pounder, American 76 on the later Shermans, French relics in static positions, the 88 they trusted, the Soviet 85 they respected. This noise, this slow building howl that seemed to start beyond the horizon and end under their tracks, was something else. He heard the second shot coming before he saw the flash. The whine rose again, but this time his brain had learned something from the first. This was heavier, 90 millimeters, he thought with a cold precision that surprised him. This is what the reports meant. The American shell landed higher up the slope, almost level with their position. It sheared a strip of frozen turf from the ridge crest and sent it cartwheeling into the air. The blast wave slapped Karl's face and made the canvas of the cupola cover snap. He ducked instinctively, tasting the grit between his teeth. The gunner, Lieutenant der Reserve Scholz, hunched over the TZF sight, was already calling ranges. 3,000, perhaps 3,100. The muzzle flash is beyond the far copse. Herr Feldwebel, that is no Sherman. Karl had read the divisional circulars in January, when the first fragments of intelligence filtered down to line units in the west, American heavy tank with a 90mm gun. Another notice later from Corps headquarters, warning of a self-propelled gun mounting the same weapon on a longer, open-top chassis. The tone of the memos had been brisk, almost casual. The frontal armor of the Königsteiger has thus far resisted direct hits at medium range, one paragraph had stated. Nevertheless, avoid unnecessary duels beyond 2,000 meters. The enemy's new weapon is to be taken seriously. 3,000 meters, Karl thought, and they are throwing rounds onto this hill, like it is a practice target. He lowered himself into the turret and crashed the cupola hatch shut. Inside, the Tiger smelled of oil, hot metal, and the stale wool of uniforms that had not been washed properly since the previous autumn. The gun breech loomed in the half-light, a familiar white-painted block. For 2 years, it had been the heart of their power, the 88mm Kampfwagenkanone that had killed T-34s on the steppe and Shermans in the hedgerows at distances where return fire merely polished the paint. "Traverse left, slow," he said. "Scholz, find that battery. If they can see us at 3,000 meters, we must be silhouetted." The hull creaked as the turret motor engaged. The long barrels swung across the valley, hunting for the muzzle flash that had bracketed them. Through the periscope, the world was a flat, grey photograph scored with fields, hedge lines, and the dark ribbon of the distant river. The Americans were on the far bank now, in strength. Somewhere among their columns were the new machines that had turned the last months of the war into a different kind of contest. Before, he remembered, The fear had mostly flowed one way. In the spring of 1943, on the southern front near Belgorod, Karl's company had gone into action with 10 fresh Tigers. Their commander had been younger then, their confidence unshaken. The Soviets came on with waves of T-34s, good tanks, but not exceptional in his quiet, professional estimation. At 1,500 meters, the gunner's voice would be almost bored as he called out, "Panzer ahead, slightly left, range 1,500, and the 88 would bark. Through the sight, the green shapes would flare, halt, burn. The enemy shells hit their front plate and left white scars, some shallow craters, but rarely did they pierce. Afterwards, they had walked among the wrecks, holes in the T-34 turrets you could almost crawl through, turret roofs peeled back, tracks twisted off. The Soviet crews were often poor boys, sometimes barely trained. Many had died without ever seeing what killed them. The legend of the Tiger grew from such days. Crews spoke of it in mess tents and dugouts. A Tiger could kill a T-34 at 2,000 meters and a Sherman at 1,500, and the return fire might as well have been thrown stones, unless it came from the flank. Western propaganda exaggerated, but not by much. Even the enemy respected the beast. Allied tank commanders had to brief their crews soberly. Never engage a Tiger from the front if you can avoid it. Go for the side, the rear, the tracks. Use the terrain. Call artillery. Now, in the winter of 1945, the symmetry had shifted. The third American round came in lower, walking its way up the slope. This one was aimed. Impact was below the crest, short of the Tiger itself, but close enough that the hull rocked slightly on its torsion bars. Dust cascaded from the turret roof. The loader glanced up involuntarily, as if he expected the plate above his head to sag. "They are ranging on us," Schultz muttered. "At 3,000 meters. With what corrections at this distance?" He squeezed the grips of his sight tighter, as if he could steady the entire war that way. "Report from battalion. Says they have tank destroyers with the 90mm as well," Meissner said, voice pitched too high. "Open turret. Thin armor. But the gun—" "Enough!" Karl snapped, more sharply than he intended. The tension coiled in the cramped hull had to be cut somewhere, and the loader's running commentary was the easiest point. "We know what they have. We also know the limitations of our maps. There are folds of ground they cannot see, even with that gun. We will withdraw 10 meters, use the reverse slope." Another roar built in the sky. This one farther to their right. A second impact flung mud over the neighboring Tiger, number 204. In the radio net, an excited voice crackled, half drowned by static. "Battery fire from the far bank. This is 2nd Platoon. They are engaging us from beyond 2,500. I repeat, beyond 2,500. Beyond the sharp words lay something Karl recognized, not as panic, but as the beginning of a particular realization. For years, they had listened to Allied crews talk about the 88 fear. The knowledge that a German heavy tank or anti-tank gun could reach out and kill at ranges where their own weapons could do little more than scratch. Now, here on this exposed hill in the Hunsrück, it was the Tiger crews who heard the whistle of a gun they could not yet answer, and felt the balance of power slide. Later, historians would argue about the exact performance figures of the American 90mm gun. On paper, its standard armor-piercing shells could penetrate perhaps 150 millimeters of plate at 1,000 meters under favorable angles. With high-velocity armor-piercing projectiles, the figures rose sharply. In tests at proving grounds with perfect steel and perfect angles, charts showed neat curves. Penetration at 500, at 1,000, at 1,500. In practice, the numbers blurred in smoke, mud, and fear. What mattered to men like Karl was simpler. A chiming in the steel under his boots when a near miss shook the ground at 3,000 meters, and the knowledge that if the Americans walked their fire a little farther, the next shell might arrive on the turret ring instead of the ridge. "Back driver," he ordered. 3 vehicle lengths. Slow. Keep the nose down. The Maybach engine growled, obedient but strained. Fuel was low. They had enough for the day's planned movements, barely, if they did not squander it on unnecessary repositioning. But there was no calculation in his mind now between liters and safety. The Tiger eased backward, nose dipping, until only the upper third of the turret showed above the thin skyline. Earth swallowed the lower hull like a wave. In other circumstances, they might have answered with their own long-range fire. The 88 could reach out to 3,000 meters, even beyond, if the target presented enough of a silhouette. Karl had once watched a Soviet tank destroyer disintegrate under a well-aimed shot at what the rangefinder recorded as 2,800, but that had been on the steppe, with endless distance and low vegetation under a clear summer sky. On this February morning in the west, haze, folds of ground, and the uncertain shimmer over the river made the far bank a soft blur in the sight. Schultz could see muzzle flashes, yes, but not clearly enough to place his crosshairs on a specific gun shield or turret front. "They are firing from hull-down positions behind that second rise," the gunner said. "Even if we lay on, it will be a lottery, and for each shot we fire, they will see the flash." Karl knew the doctrine. In the opening months of the war, their orders had often been aggressive to the point of recklessness: close, flank, drive-through, exploit. Later, as losses mounted and tanks became rarer, the manuals had shifted. Avoid exposing valuable heavy vehicles unnecessarily. Use prepared positions. Coordinate with infantry and anti-tank guns. Even now, in these last desperate weeks, higher headquarters still spoke of the Tiger as a Schwerpunktwaffe, a weapon to shape the battlefield where the blow fell heaviest. Today, that meant this ridge. But a dead Tiger was not a Schwerpunkt. It was a tomb. On the radio, voices overlapped. Then a company commander's calmer tone cut through. "All Tigers, this is Rolf. Enemy heavy guns engaging from long range. Do not present silhouettes on the crest. Withdraw to covered positions. We will not trade irreplaceable vehicles in a duel at 3,000 meters." There was a pause, and then, more quietly, in a way that made the message less official and more real. "You have all heard the reports. Those 90mm guns kill Königsteiger from the front at shorter distances. Our armor is not invincible. Choose your ground. Live to fight where it matters." The admission settled over the crew, more heavily than the dust from the impacts. For months, rumors had filtered back from the east about Soviet guns that could punch through the King Tiger's nose at close range. In the west, the first encounters with American tank destroyers mounting the 90mm had been recorded in dry staff reports that circulated in photocopied fragments down to battalion. A Tiger II hit at 900 meters and burning. Another immobilized by a frontal strike. Crew killed. There had been attempts to explain it away. Faulty plate, unlucky angle, unusual ammunition. It was easier to blame steel than admit that the equation of fear had become two-sided. At night, in dugouts and commandeered farmhouses, the talk among veteran crews had grown quieter. They knew the statistics. They had seen that their own losses, once rare, had become alarmingly common since the previous summer. Air power, fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and artillery all played their parts. But the idea that somewhere out there, beyond the usual reach of tank guns, the enemy now possessed a weapon that could hunt them at the ranges they had once considered their own. This gnawed at men who had built their identity on the superiority of their armor and their gun. Karl remembered one evening in January, in a half-ruined barn near Trier, when a replacement crew had joined their company. The new men had come from another heavy battalion that had been withdrawn after severe losses. Their Tiger had burned near Aachen when an American self-propelled gun, they said, had put a 90mm shell straight through the upper glacis from what they swore was over 2,000 meters. The commander still had the range estimate written in a notebook, a number he repeated like a curse. "We did everything right," the man had muttered over thin coffee, staring into nothing. "Hull down. Good camouflage. We fired first. And then, bang!" He had spread his hands in the air, like the front of the hull was made of paper. We climbed out through the hatches and watched the fire. I could not believe it. A tiger, burning from the front. Someone had scoffed gently at the time, blaming poor steel in late war production batches, always a comforting scapegoat. Another had pointed out that distances were easily misjudged in the chaos. But nobody laughed it away entirely, not when too many similar stories arrived from different fronts, told by men whose faces carried the same mixture of anger and bewilderment. On this ridge, under the search of the American battery, the stories gained weight. Another salvo came in, this time farther along the line where a Koenigsteiger had taken up an ambitious overwatch position the previous day. The round struck the forward slope just below its hull, throwing earth over the massive front plate. The big tank rocked, backed uncertainly, then ground its way down the reverse face of the hill, engine roaring louder than prudence dictated. Through the periscope, Karl saw the sudden, almost undignified haste in its movements. "Even they are pulling back," Meissner said. "Yesterday they were boasting that nothing short of a naval gun could hurt them from the front." "Boasting is for peacetime," Karl replied. "In war, steel and trajectories decide." He rested a hand briefly on the turret wall, feeling not the invulnerability they had once taken for granted, but the thickness as one term in a larger equation. Armor had always been a margin, never an absolute. Outside, the valley boomed again. The Americans were not firing blind barrages. The pattern of impacts was too deliberate. They were probing, testing the slopes, walking their fire along likely positions. Somewhere among their forward observers, perhaps equipped now with better optics and radios, someone was calling the corrections, learning the way the shells flew over this particular landscape. Each explosion was not only an attack, but a piece of data. Karl thought suddenly of their own proving grounds. Back in the Reich, at Kummersdorf, and elsewhere. In the earlier years, he imagined, absurdly, an American colonel now standing by a test Tiger Hulk, watching 90mm shells slam into plates at measured distances, recording penetration or spalling, talking calmly about angles and velocities, while far away, men like him learned the consequences in blood. "Feldwebel," Schultz said quietly. "If they decide to combine this with observation from the air, we will not even see the first accurate shots. We are used to being the ones who can kill at long range. Now they are teaching us what it feels like from the other side." Karl nodded, though the gunner could not see it. In the headset, a faint secondary net crackled with a conversation between another company and regimental headquarters. Phrases drifted through the static. "New American heavy tank. 90mm gun. Engagement at over 2,000 meters." Woven with the same dry language of range, angle, and outcome they had used for years. Only the roles had shifted. "Driver, hold here," he ordered. "We stay below the crest. If infantry tries to come up, we will still have line of sight at 500. That is our world. Let the big guns fight their own duel." Underneath the words, unspoken but understood, lay another thought that had begun to spread through the heavy battalions in these months. You cannot fight what you cannot see, and you do not have to die on someone else's terms. In the weeks to come, this quiet conclusion would harden into behavior that staff officers, reading reports later, would describe with euphemisms. Early evacuation of vehicles from threatened sectors. Disengagement in the face of superior firepower. In plainer speech, crews abandoned positions, and sometimes even their tanks, rather than sit under the invisible reach of large-caliber guns that had finally made them feel like the hunted instead of the hunter. For men like Karl, it was not cowardice. It was the belated recognition that the war had changed shape. The Tiger was still formidable at close and medium ranges, still deadly in ambush, still rightly feared by any Sherman commander who saw its silhouette appear at a crossroads. But the days when its mere presence on a ridge could dominate everything within 2,000 meters had ended when the first American 90mm guns rolled off ships in Antwerp and Le Havre, and when the first German crews heard that uncanny whistle over 3,000 meters of air and watched the ground around them erupt. Outside, the distant guns paused. Smoke drifted across the valley in pale sheets. Somewhere on the far bank, a battery commander adjusted his fire plan, perhaps shifting attention to another suspected position. Brief silence fell over the ridge, the kind that made every creak of metal and every cough inside the hull sound too loud. In that lull, sitting half-buried behind the crest, Karl felt something he had not known in the Rusland summers or the Normandy hedges. It was not the familiar adrenaline of an upcoming attack, nor the controlled fear before an assault. It was a quieter thing, a dawning awareness that they were no longer the undisputed masters of the range table. He exhaled slowly, tasting still the dust of foreign earth in his mouth, and thought not of the next engagement, but of the logic behind the men who had designed these new guns. Somewhere, years earlier, engineers and officers on the other side of the ocean had looked at the statistics from North Africa, from Italy, from early encounters with tigers and panthers, and decided that the answer was a weapon that could erase the comfort zone of German heavy armor, a gun that would make crews like his think twice before sitting on any skyline. They had succeeded. Karl glanced at the range drum on the gunner's sight, with its neat graduations out to 3,000 meters and beyond, and then at the steel ring of the turret around him. He wondered, briefly, if the men in charge in Berlin had ever fully understood how it felt to be inside this cylinder of metal when world events turned it from a spear point into a target. The radio crackled again with new orders. American infantry had been seen moving toward the lower slopes. There would be fighting yet today, at ranges where the old rules still partly applied, where the 88 could speak with authority, and where camouflage, patience, and a well-chosen field of fire could still make the difference between life and death. Karl settled his headset more firmly and leaned closer to the intercom. "All right," he said. "We stay here. We do not climb the crest again. If they want us, they will have to come into our range. Remember, we are not invincible. We are still dangerous. That is enough." The crew answered in short, clipped acknowledgments. No one mentioned the 90mm guns on the far bank. They did not need to. The sound of those weapons, and the way they had walked their fire casually up to 3,000 meters, had already carved itself into the map inside each man's mind. They would carry that echo with them into every future engagement, a new constant in the mental arithmetic of survival. And long after the war, when veteran Tiger commanders sat in quiet living rooms and told their stories to grandchildren or historians, they would speak not only of the days when their 88s ruled the battlefield, but also of that strange, unsettling moment when they first heard a heavier whistle in the air, realized that someone else had finally learned to reach as far as they once had, and understood, with a shock that felt almost physical, that the era of their dominance had ended. That realization, more than any single shell, was what made some crews throttle back, drop off ridge lines, and in a few bitter cases, simply walk away from their machines when the unseen 90mm guns began to rake the horizon. It was not that the Tiger had become a bad tank overnight. It was that the war had finally caught up with it. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you're enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The infantry came first. From their half-frozen hiding place behind the crest, Karl's crew heard the distant clatter of tracks and the dull thump of mortars, but the sounds that mattered now were closer and softer: boots scuffing on frosted grass, low voices in English, the occasional click of a rifle safety. The Americans were feeling forward, testing the lower slopes under the cover of their own artillery and the occasional crackle of machine gun fire from the village below. Through the periscope, the world narrowed to the arc just beyond the broken fence line at the foot of the hill. Brown figures moved in ones and twos, hunched rifles at the ready, helmets bobbing. Here, at 500 to 700 meters, the old geometry returned. The 88 was in its element again. Over open sights, Schultz could lay the crosshairs on a tree trunk, a low wall, the corner of a ruin, and know what his shell would do. when it arrived. "High explosive, point detonating," Karl ordered. "We are not revealing ourselves for every squad, only when they bunch up." The loader swung a squat, blunt-nosed, high-explosive round into the breach. The empty brass clanged against the catch basket. In the background, the distant 90mm guns on the far bank shifted their fire elsewhere, satisfied, for the moment, that the ridge's silhouettes had vanished. The strange, unnerving long-range duel faded from immediate awareness, like a half-remembered nightmare. In its place came the familiar grind of local battle. When a platoon of Americans reached the low stone wall halfway up the slope and paused to regroup, Karl gave the word. The 88 spoke with its sharp, flat crack, the recoil shoving the turret back against its stops. Through the sight, Schultz watched the shell walk into the wall, saw dust and stone erupt and men scatter. A second round caught them as they tried to fall back. This time, the burst was among them. Figures flung down, some not getting up. For a moment, the crew tasted again the old rhythm. Aim, fire, correct, devastation. The Tiger was still what it had always been at such ranges, an over-caliber field gun on tracks, terrifying in its accuracy and its effect. The infantry attack stalled. Radio chatter from neighboring positions reported similar local successes, yet even as the gun smoked and the loader reached for another high-explosive shell, a piece of that earlier realization remained lodged like shrapnel in the back of their minds. Beyond the range scale that currently mattered, someone else's heavy gun still owned the valley. They were reduced to working in the space below its envelope, like men sheltering under a low ceiling while a storm raged above. By midday, the Americans shifted tactics. Their 90mm guns continued to harass the crest and the reverse slopes, but more cautiously. Shorter salvos, unexpected pauses, attempts to catch any German vehicle that dared raise more than a turret above the skyline. Instead of grinding frontal attacks up the hill, infantry probed along the flanks, feeling for seams between company sectors. In the afternoon, a message came from battalion headquarters that framed the day's events in a language that sounded official but carried an undercurrent of unease. Reports confirm enemy employment of 90mm anti-tank guns and tank destroyers at extended ranges, the operations officer's voice announced over the net. Frontal armor of heavy tanks no longer guarantees immunity beyond 2,000 meters. All units to adapt tactics accordingly, avoid exposed positions, do not permit the enemy to dictate range. Karl listened without comment. Adapt tactics accordingly. In practice, that meant something very simple. Do not do what they had been trained to do for 3 years, on the steppe and in Italy. Do not climb the best hill and dominate the field from there. Instead, slink in hollows, fire from behind rubble, trade the wide horizons their guns loved for the cramped, dirt-smelling safety of folds in the ground. That evening, with the battery on the far bank finally falling silent, the company pulled back into the woods behind the village. Fuel trucks came up under cover of darkness. Men sat on the backs of their hulls, eating thin soup from mess tins, smoking, talking more quietly than usual. Someone from 2nd Platoon told the story of what had happened earlier that day to a Tiger 2 a few kilometers down the line. It had tried to change position to counter a suspected American thrust toward a road junction. As it crested a low rise, at what the crew judged was a safe distance from the river, a 90mm shell had met it, with unnerving precision, punching through the front plate just above the driver's visor. The tank had burned within minutes. No one had escaped. "Range?" someone asked. "About 2,400, according to the surviving escort half-track," the storyteller said. "Maybe closer, maybe farther, it does not matter. Before, we would have laughed at such a thing. Now we are supposed to adjust." They did adjust, but in that adjustment lay the quiet erosion of a belief system. When the Tiger first appeared in the East in late 1942 and early 1943, its arrival had been as much psychological as tactical. Soviet tank crews, already accustomed to fighting German Panzer IIIs and IVs, suddenly found themselves facing a machine that seemed to shrug off their standard guns at any reasonable range. The 88 could reach out to distances where T-34 crews had never before seen a tank duel. Stories spread quickly. Tigers that knocked out a dozen T-34s and drove away with hardly a scratch. Soviet infantry who watched shells bounce like raindrops from their fronts. On the Western Front, a similar legend grew in 1943 and 1944. In Tunisia, then in Italy, then in Normandy, Allied crews had to learn the hard way that the frontal armor of a Tiger or a well-handled Panther was not to be trifled with. In gunnery schools back in Britain and America, instructors hammered home the rule: never engage a Tiger frontally if you can avoid it. The recommended ranges and angles were printed on cards: 500 meters from the side, 300 from the rear, always at right angles if possible. Anything else was gambling with your life. German crews absorbed this, not from charts, but from the stunned expressions of the few captured Allied tankers they met, and from the casualty figures in their battalion reports. Being in a Tiger meant that, for once, you were on the feared side of the range table. Your enemies had to crawl closer than they liked, expose themselves, risk flanking maneuvers under fire. You could sit back, conceal yourself moderately well, and let the 88 do its work. The war, however, did not freeze at those first encounters. Engineers on the other side of the front lines watched, counted, measured. In laboratories and proving grounds, far from the smoke and fear, they studied the very same properties of steel and velocity that German designers had used to create the Tiger's advantage. The American 90mm gun, born from that process, was not a sudden miracle, but the result of years of design and argument, delayed by bureaucracy and doctrine, then rushed into combat when the casualty reports from North Africa and Italy became impossible to ignore. Its ballistics was simple in theory, complex in practice. With standard armor-piercing shells, it delivered enough striking energy to punch through thick plates at respectable ranges. With experimental high-velocity rounds, its capabilities grew further. At proving grounds, a well-aimed 90mm projectile could crack heavy armor beyond what older charts considered decisive. But the real impact of the gun was not measured in millimeters alone. It was measured in how it forced German crews to reconsider the whole mental map of what was safe and what was not. At 3,000 meters, neither the Tiger's 88 nor the American 90mm could consistently place a shell on a moving tank, especially over broken ground. But the fact that one side was willing and able to try, and to walk shells close enough to shower a ridge with deadly fragments, changed decisions at every level. A battery commander who knew his guns could reach a hull-down Tiger at the far edge of the valley did not need to send his own tanks on a costly frontal assault. A German company commander who had once considered any position beyond 1,500 meters from the enemy lines a comfortable overwatch had to think again. The next week, Karl's company was ordered eastward, away from the river, toward a sector where the fighting was more confused, more fluid, and, for the moment, less dominated by distant guns. They left the valley at night, marching along half-ruined roads through villages that smelled of damp plaster and smoke. Fuel convoys came up at odd hours, escorted tightly by infantry against roaming fighter bombers and partisans. As they moved, rumors flowed in the opposite direction. Stories from the Rhine crossings, where American tank destroyer battalions had pushed their lighter, open-topped 90mm guns across precarious pontoon bridges to support fragile bridgeheads. Reports of Tiger IIs knocked out on distant ridges by long-range fire that the crews had dismissed as impossible even weeks earlier. The stories were often contradictory in details, ranges, angles, ammunition types, but consistent in their core. The enemy now possessed a weapon that no longer respected the old comfort zones. In one village, they met a Königsteiger platoon from another regiment that had just been pulled out of the line. The huge tanks loomed over the street, their squat, angular turrets dwarfing even the Tiger's familiar bulk. Their crews, exhausted and wary, spoke in low voices over cigarettes. "They told us the front plate was invulnerable," one man said, touching a ragged, roughly circular scar on his hull where a shell had struck and cracked but not quite penetrated. "Maybe it still is at certain ranges, but what difference does it make if they hit here?" He slapped the thinner lower nose plate, or here, he tapped the turret ring. From distances where we were supposed to be untouchable. Another crew, less fortunate, had abandoned their burned tank on a hill near Remagen after a 90mm shell had gone clean through the forward armor, igniting ammunition. The commander showed Karl a photograph someone had taken with a small camera, a neat, almost surgical hole in the once proud plate, ringed with spall and soot. "We left it in," the man said in a flat voice. "We were ordered to after we bailed out. No recovery vehicles, no time, just torches to melt the optics. It felt like walking away from a cathedral that had been struck by lightning." The idea of abandoning such a machine, the culmination of so much steel and labor, would have been unthinkable in 1943. In 1945, under the new reality of distant guns and empty fuel depots, it became a bitter necessity. On the American side of the lines, a different psychological curve was unfolding. For tank and tank destroyer crews who had spent the first years of the war learning to fear the 88 at long range, the arrival of their own 90mm weapons offered, if not safety, then at least a sense of parity. In training areas in England and later in rear zones in France and Belgium, instructors now had something new to show their students. Charts that did not stop apologetically short of the Tiger's armor figures. Still, it took time for theory to turn into field confidence. The 90mm gun was mounted only on a relatively small number of tanks and self-propelled guns late in the war. Shermans with 75mm guns continued to do most of the heavy lifting, often using flanking tactics and sheer numbers rather than raw penetration to deal with German heavies. Tank destroyer battalions with 76mm guns on lighter chassis developed doctrines, as they had around Normandy and in the Ardennes, that emphasized ambush, pack tactics, knowledge of enemy weak spots. When 90mm guns arrived at the front in the winter of 1944 to 1945, they were folded into this existing fabric. Some units received a handful of the new tanks as spearheads. Others re-equipped entire companies for specific missions. The crews had to learn quickly how to use their extended range without falling into the trap of thinking that the new weapon alone would solve everything. The first time a 90mm shell went through the front of a heavy German tank at what had once been considered a safe distance, word spread as fast among American units as stories of the opposite had once spread among German crews. But with the satisfaction of finally being able to hit back at long range came a responsibility not to overestimate the gun's power. Armor was still armor, angles still mattered, weather, visibility, and terrain could still turn neat penetration curves into messy reality. In one test series, at an American proving ground, engineers placed sections of captured German armor plates at various angles and distances. They fired standard armor-piercing and high-velocity rounds, recording impact velocities, penetration depths, and secondary effects like spalling. The results showed clearly that at certain ranges and angles, the 90mm could defeat even thick, well-sloped plates. At others, it would fail or only produce deep craters. The transition between safe and unsafe was not a cliff, but a slope littered with conditions. On the German side, tankers received none of those graphs. What they received were fragments of reports filtered through several echelons of command, often phrased cautiously, sometimes distorted. Isolated case of frontal penetration, likely due to inferior armor quality in late war production. One circular might say. Another would emphasize the still strong points. At ranges beyond 1,800 meters, heavy tanks remain largely resistant to most Allied guns at frontal aspects. The overall effect was to soften the blow without eliminating it. At the front, crews simplified the message in their own way. They began to speak less of invulnerability and more of probabilities. A Koenigsteiger might still shrug off most hits at certain ranges, but most was no longer all. A Tiger might still be a formidable presence at 1,000 meters, but that did not mean safety at 2,000. Once, German crews had talked about Allied tanks respectfully, but often with a condescending edge. By early 1945, there was more caution, more references to specific Allied units and weapons that had proven themselves unpleasantly effective. For Karl and his crew, The next weeks brought a mixture of close, brutal encounters in villages and woods, and fewer, but no less important, brushes with the distant 90mm guns. Each time they heard that particular whistle overhead, they reacted more quickly, dropping off skylines, cutting engines, hugging buildings, or reverse slopes. Each time they survived, but each time the experience pressed a little deeper into their nerves. In one action, near a forest edge, they found themselves acting alongside a battery of German anti-tank guns equipped with their own long-barreled 75mm weapons. The guns' crews, veterans like themselves, were moving cautiously, dragging their pieces forward into camouflage positions, knowing that a single unseen 90mm shell could render their work pointless in a flash. The battery commander, a Hauptmann with tired eyes, made a wry remark as they compared notes over a field map. "Once, we were the ones who made the others hug the earth," he said. "Now, we learn humility. Perhaps it is overdue. No gun stays supreme forever." For the Americans on the opposite ridge, similar conversations were happening in reverse. In a dugout overlooking another valley, a 90mm tank destroyer crew talked quietly after their first confirmed kill of a heavy German tank at long range. The gunner had done everything by the book: range estimation, allowance for wind, careful tracking of the enemy's slight movements. The shell had gone metina where it was supposed to, and the distant shape had bloomed with smoke and fire. The loader, younger and more excitable, spoke of it with a kind of stunned elation. "They hit him front on over 2,000 yards. All this time, they told us, you had to sneak up on those beasts, and now we can reach out and touch them." The commander, older and more seasoned, tempered the enthusiasm. "Once," he said. "Today. Next time there might be a crosswind we do not see, or a patch of soft ground that makes him dip just as we fire. This gun is good, but it is not magic. The man in that German tank probably thought the same about his 88 once. Then someone proved him wrong." He paused, then added, "Remember that when you see them pull back off a hill, fear cuts both ways. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this." In the last months of the war, such mirrored realizations. German crews discovering that their armor no longer guaranteed safety, American crews discovering that their newest guns still needed respect and care, converged into a new, more sober understanding of armored combat. The age of the single, overwhelmingly dominant tank or gun was ending. Firepower, armor, and mobility were now in a more delicate balance, influenced as much by logistics, air supremacy, and communications as by thickness of plate or caliber of bore. For the men inside the turrets, however, these strategic truths distilled into simpler, sharper impressions. For a German Tiger commander like Karl, the sound of a distant 90mm salvo, even when it landed short, became a visceral warning. Do not stay where you are obvious. Do not sit on the skyline because the manual from 1943 said that is where you belong. Do not trust that your beloved 88 and your thick front plate will shield you from everything beyond 1,500 meters. The enemy has done their homework. They have built a tool specifically to erase that comfort. For an American 90mm gunner, the sight of a Tiger or Koenigsteiger slipping back behind a hill instead of brazenly occupying its crest was its own kind of message. The legend on which so many training lectures and bitter battlefield anecdotes had been built was changing. The monster on the hill was now behaving more like any other cautious, vulnerable tank. It could still kill at frightening ranges, it could still shrug off lesser hits, but it could be hurt, and its crews knew it. That knowledge did not make the 90mm crews invulnerable. German tanks and anti-tank guns, cleverly handled, continued to exact a heavy toll on Allied armor right up to the last weeks. A 90mm gun mounted on a clumsy chassis and sent blindly into a village could die just as quickly as any Sherman. Mines, Panzerfausts, close-range ambushes in forests or built-up areas did not care what the penetration curve on a chart looked like. Yet, on open ground, In those brief weather windows when observation stretched out to 3,000 meters and beyond, something intangible had shifted. You can measure armor thickness and shell weight. You cannot easily measure the moment when a man in a cupola, once so sure of his supremacy, tells his driver to back off a hill because of a sound in the distance. That moment, multiplied across companies and battalions, contributed more to the erosion of German armored confidence than any single destroyed tank. Tigers and Königsteigers still rolled, their guns still boomed. But the way their crews chose positions, the ranges at which they were willing to engage, the risk they were prepared to accept, all of that had been subtly but decisively altered by the arrival of a weapon whose most immediate message came not in the statistics of a test range, but in the heavy whistle of a shell that could land close at 3,000 meters. For Karl, the war narrowed steadily after that first day on the Hunsrück Ridge. The grand sweeps of armored maneuver that had once occupied his imagination were replaced by short, sharp actions in woods, villages, and on the edges of small towns. Fuel grew scarcer. Maintenance became more improvisation than procedure. The radio net grew thinner as units were destroyed or withdrawn. He survived several more close engagements, one of them at barely 80 meters in a narrow street where his 88 blew apart a Sherman that had come around a corner too fast. In those moments, the Tiger was again the undisputed master, its thick armor and heavy gun overwhelming anything in front of it. But each such victory felt smaller, more local, less connected to the broader outcome. Above and beyond, the war was now being decided by other forces, bombers in formations that stretched from horizon to horizon, cut-off fuel lines, collapsing fronts hundreds of kilometers away. The 90mm guns did not win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. They arrived late, in limited numbers, and many of their potential duels with German heavies never happened because other elements of the Allied advance outpaced or bypassed them. Yet in the narrow band of time and space where they did appear, they managed something rare. They made the crews of Tigers and Königsteigers feel, if only intermittently, what everyone else had felt under the 88 since 1942. That sense that someone, somewhere, had finally built a gun that could reach out and touch them at the ranges where they had once sat and fired with near impunity, contributed to an invisible but real psychological shift. Under its pressure, some crews retreated sooner, others chose more conservative positions, a few, confronted with yet another order to hold a hill under unseen long-range fire, quietly abandoned their tanks when the chance came, deciding that no steel was worth their lives if the old equations no longer held. In the late spring of 1945, as the front disintegrated and isolated pockets of resistance were crushed or bypassed, more and more German heavy tanks were found by advancing Allied troops not knocked out in heroic last stands, but sitting abandoned in woods, villages, and along roadsides. Some had been immobilized by mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Others showed no obvious physical damage at all, no penetration holes, no burned interiors. Their crews had simply walked away. Historians would later list many reasons for such abandonments: the hopelessness of the overall situation, the impossibility of resupply or repair, the desire of experienced crews to surrender to Western rather than Soviet forces, the general collapse of discipline in the last days. Among those reasons, quieter and less quantifiable, was this: the knowledge that the old belief in their tanks' invulnerability, at least from the front and at long range, had been broken. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, out of sight but not out of earshot, the enemy's 90mm guns had replaced the myth of the untouchable Tiger with a harsher, more symmetrical truth. The battlefields where this truth was first learned are now quiet. The ridge above the Winter Valley has long since grown over with new grass. The villages have been rebuilt. Children play along the old tracks where tanks once ground their way into position. In museums, behind railings and plaques, Tigers and Koenigsteigers stand in restored paint, their thick plates cool to the touch, their 88mm barrels pointing at nothing. Visitors read captions that summarize their specifications: weight, armor thickness, gun caliber. Some displays mention briefly that Allied development of more powerful guns eventually reduced the German heavy's advantage. Fewer exhibits dwell on what that meant to the men inside the turrets when they first heard an unfamiliar whistle over 3,000 meters of air and felt the earth erupt uncomfortably close under their tracks. Yet, in the memories of those who survived on both sides, that sound lingered as clearly as any impact. For the American gunners, it was the report of their own 90mm, the solid recoil and the brief, heart-stopping wait to see if the distant shot had found its mark. For German Tiger crews like Karl, it was the incoming note, the transition from distant whine to tearing roar, the realization that what they had once done to others at long range could now be done to them. In that exchange of sounds, somewhere between the valley floor and the ridge, the last illusions of armored invulnerability burned away. And from that moment on, whenever a German heavy tank commander looked at a clear, open hill and thought of taking it, he would also remember the day he heard the 90mm guns fire at 3,000 meters, and, more often than not, tell his driver, quietly but firmly, to stay in the shadows instead. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Heinemann's report, submitted a month later to the Bundeswehr's newly formed Material Office, began with a sentence that would have been unthinkable to him in 1942. The American quarter-ton, four-wheel drive truck, Willys Overland Model MB, represents a more successful realization of the concept of military mobility than any light vehicle produced in Germany during the recent war. He did not write those words lightly. In the pages that followed, he laid out his findings with the same meticulousness he had once applied to Maybach test data. He detailed the odometer reading and service records of the Grafenwöhr Jeep, the compression values and bore measurements, the modest but even wear patterns. He compared them to captured Wehrmacht maintenance reports from 1943 and 44, drawing tables that set the numbers side by side. Average field life for Kübelwagen engines under front conditions, 6 to 12,000 kilometers before overhaul. Average for light truck engines, often less, especially in Russia. Documented cases of Panthers and Tigers requiring major engine work before 500 kilometers in winter. Against that, a single Jeep reaching more than 80,000 kilometers with its original block and crank, a number supported, not contradicted, by other Allied records and post-war civilian use. Heinemann did not romanticize anything. He noted the Jeep's weaknesses, its lack of armor, its vulnerability to mines and small arms fire, the relative discomfort of its leaf-sprung ride on long marches. He pointed out that its flathead engine, while durable, sacrificed efficiency and power per liter compared to more advanced overhead valve designs. But the conclusion was unavoidable, measured not in elegance or specific output, but in kilometers traveled between major failures, in hours of functioning service rather than workshop time. The American machine was in a class the German wartime designs had not reached. What troubled Heinemann most was not the gap itself, but the reasons behind it. In an appendix to his report, he drafted a short essay under the heading Über Konstruktionsphilosophien im Vergleich, on comparative design philosophies. He began with his own education. In the 1930s, at technical universities in Munich and Berlin, engineering students were taught to revere precision. They learned to design crankshafts balanced to the finest tolerances, to specify fits measured in hundredths or thousandths of a millimeter, to calculate bearing loads with little margin beyond what mathematics demanded. Efficiency, compactness, and elegance were praised. Over-dimensioning was considered a kind of moral failing. In that intellectual climate, the Maybach HL engines made sense. They were masterpieces of tightly toleranced design, coaxing high power from limited fuel and materials. In peacetime, with regular service and careful operation, they might have enjoyed long lives. War, however, was not peacetime. It was mud and dust and drivers who skipped warm-up procedures under fire. It was fuel of varying quality, oil changes delayed because convoys were late, filters that clogged with Balkan mud or Saharan sand, radiators punctured by shrapnel and patched improvisationally. A design that clung too close to its theoretical limits had no room to absorb such abuse. The American approach, as Heinemann now saw it, had accepted this from the beginning. The Jeep's designers made their engine heavier than strictly necessary. They chose a conservative compression ratio and robust castings. They allowed wider clearances, not out of sloppiness, but to ensure that dust, thermal expansion, and thickened oil would not immediately destroy a bearing or seize a piston. They adopted an oil bath air cleaner that looked archaic to German eyes precisely because it was easier to maintain in the field by undertrained personnel. They did not ask whether the engine could survive a carefully orchestrated bench test. They asked whether it would keep working after a conscript had driven it through a river, parked it wet in the frost, then forgotten to change the oil on schedule. The same philosophy extended beyond the engine. The Jeep's chassis accepted that leaf springs would ride more harshly than more sophisticated independent suspensions, but would be stronger, easier to repair, and cheaper to produce. Its frame was simple, flat, and suited to welding fixtures that unskilled labor could operate under supervision. Its wiring harnesses were accessible and replaceable. Even its seats were based on designs that could be repaired with basic tools and materials. Looking back across the war years, Heinemann realized that the real shock for men like him had not been the individual technical solutions, but the willingness to embrace good enough as a virtue when it led to systems that actually survived campaigns. The 80,000-kilometer Jeep at Grafenwöhr was not a miracle. It was what happened when such a philosophy was put into metal and then given to an army able to support it with fuel, spares, and procedures. In the winter of 1955, as the new Bundeswehr took its first cautious steps and West Germany anchored itself inside NATO, Heinemann was invited to sit on a procurement commission evaluating light vehicles for the fledgling force. The brochures on the table combined German names and foreign ones. There were proposals for licensed production of updated Volkswagens, offers of surplus American M38s and newer M38A1s, sketches of experimental designs no one yet had the money to build. The younger officers around the table were veterans of Normandy, the Ardennes, or the Italian campaign. They had ridden in jeeps, in Kübelwagens, in whatever they could fight or flee in. They carried their own prejudices and loyalties. One of them, a colonel who had commanded a reconnaissance battalion in 1941, tapped the cover of an American technical manual. "We cannot build our future army on foreign tools alone," he said. "We must have our own designs again, German designs." Heinemann watched the others nod. He understood the sentiment. Pride was a currency in short supply in that room. But he also thought of the Jeep in the shed at Grafenwöhr, of the row upon row of dead Panthers he had inspected east of the Oder, of the long lists in Oberkommando reports of tanks awaiting engine spares that never came. He opened his notebook to the appendix of his own recent report and spoke more quietly than the colonel, but with a weight his colleagues recognized. "If we design our own vehicles," he said, "we must decide first what we value most. If we chase perfection on the test stand and in the sales brochure, we will repeat our old mistake. We will produce machines that impress engineers and fail soldiers." He tapped the drawing of the Jeep's simple frame. This little American truck was not perfect. It leaked oil. Its seats bruised the spine. It was loud, crude, and dangerous under fire. But it ran. It started after weeks in the open. It forgave incompetence. The men who drove it did not love it because it was beautiful. They loved it because it was there, day after day. He looked around the table. When we write specifications now, when we sign off on tolerances and materials, we must ask, will this still move after 10 winters, after 10 years, after 80,000 kilometers of bad roads? Silence held for a few moments. The colonel, who had spoken earlier, leaned back, considering. He had lost friends in tanks that had stopped not because of enemy shells, but because of failed machinery. 80,000, he repeated softly, in a vehicle no one will ever put on a parade poster. He picked up the Jeep manual and thumbed it thoughtfully. Perhaps, he said, our new German designs must learn from foreign sins and virtues alike. The discussion moved on to budgets and alliances and industrial capabilities, but a line had been drawn quietly in Heinemann's mind. War, he thought, had been a brutal but effective teacher. It had shown him that reliability was not a side effect of precision, but a discipline of its own. It demanded restraint where his training had encouraged ambition. It demanded that he imagined the worst user, not the best, the dirtiest fuel, not the cleanest, the coldest winter, not the design temperature. He thought of the German mechanics he had known who had cursed at seized Maybachs in snow-choked forests, and of American GIs in muddy jackets who had taken it for granted that their Jeeps would start. He thought of the way his own pride had bristled at turning the hood latch of a foreign design, then softened as the engine behind it had proven itself in cold numbers and worn metal. In the years that followed, as West German industry found its way back into automotive production, not for panzers, but for trucks, utility vehicles, and civilian cars that would fill the new autobahns, echoes of that lesson could be traced in design reviews and test reports. Axles were specified with more margin. Air filtration received more attention than it ever had in the 1930s. Technical manuals were written with clearer tables, more diagrams, less assumption of prior knowledge. Procurement officers asked quietly, "What happens when this is 20 years old?" rather than only, "How does it compare to the competition this year?" The American Jeep, that unassuming machine that German officers had once dismissed as primitive, had, in its own way, educated the very engineers and mechanics who had scorned it. On a spring day in 1960, when the trees above the Grafenwöhr sheds had begun to show green again, the Jeep, with the remarkable odometer reading, was finally retired from even training service. It had spent the past few years in a peculiar half-life, no longer driven hard across ranges, but still starting dutifully for demonstration runs, still climbing the muddy incline behind the motor pool to show new recruits what a short wheelbase 4x4 could do. On that day, a small group of soldiers and civilians gathered around it. There was no ceremony. The army did not award medals to machines, but there was a certain quiet respect in the way the mechanics laid their hands on its fenders as if closing the lid on an old tool that had outlasted its expected life. The odometer now read slightly over 52,000 miles. Heinemann, older and greyer, walked around it one last time. The paint was more faded, the canvas more patched. A few new welds on the frame bore the signature of West German workshops rather than American depots. The engine under the hood, though, was still the same block he had inspected years earlier, still starting with the same matter-of-fact willingness when the ignition was switched on. He watched as a crane gently lifted the Jeep onto a flatbed for transport to a small museum project that the Bundeswehr was assembling, a place where future soldiers and civilians would be able to see, in metal and rubber, what the brochures and commemorative books spoke of. He imagined a boy in 10 or 20 years standing in front of the display reading a plaque that might summarize its service in a few lines. Built in 1943, landed in Normandy, served with US, French, Dutch, and German forces. Total distance driven estimated at more than 80,000 kilometers. Original engine block. The boy would not feel the cold mud of the Ardennes in those numbers, nor hear the cough of a frozen Maybach refusing to start beside it. But perhaps if the plaque's author was wise, there would be one more sentence, something simple, something like, "Wars are not won only by the machines that are most powerful or most advanced, but by those that work without fail, day after day, regardless of who holds the wrench." Heinemann watched the flatbed pull away, the Jeep's silhouette shrinking between rows of new trucks bearing names and shapes that had not existed when the war ended. He felt no nostalgia for the world that had produced the machines he once served. But he did feel, unexpectedly, a kind of gratitude to the little American truck that had forced him, and, through him, his country's future engineers, to reconsider what truly mattered in steel and oil. Behind him, on the test track, a new generation of vehicles growled and rattled through their paces, some German, some American, some bearing badges from other NATO nations. They were faster, heavier, more comfortable. Their engines produced more power from less fuel. Their suspensions smoothed out ruts the Jeep would have clawed over. But as they roared past, flinging mud and water from their tires, Heinemann's mind returned, just for a moment, to a Flathead 4 idling patiently after 50,000 miles, and to 3 words he had written in his report years earlier. Es läuft weiter. It keeps running. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In the end, that was the quiet legacy of the Jeep in the minds of the men who had once underestimated it. Not a tale of marvels or of flawless engineering, but a reminder that in the chaos of war and in the messy, unpredictable life of any machine, the highest compliment one could give a design was the simplest imaginable. It keeps running. And in that unglamorous endurance, American Jeeps had covered not just 80,000 kilometers of broken roads, but the distance between two engineering cultures, teaching, by example, that durability, maintainability, and practical sufficiency could be as decisive as any battlefield innovation. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.